Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spotlight interview series, where we sit down with leaders across the medical device, pharma, and combination product industries to discuss the challenges shaping life sciences today. I'm Chuck Ventura, founder and CEO of Ventura Solutions, and your host for this Spotlight interview series. Today, I'm joined by our very own David Karvani, who is a combination product expert with a lot of great experience.
Hey Chuck, great to be here. David Karvani. I lead the business development and strategic partnerships here at Ventura Solutions. My background is in plastics and biomedical engineering. I've spent the past 17 years leading product development and commercialization. Majority of my experience is focused around parenteral devices and combination product development. So from prefilled syringes to auto injectors, pen injectors, and on-body delivery systems. I spent some time working on device platform development, but also on the pharma side, um, being part of the MedImmune AstraZeneca device development team. In the past few years, I've been supporting different clients around the product development and combination products, and it's great to be here today. Thank you, Chuck.
All right, great. So let's jump in here. There's a lot of topics that we want to touch on today here, but I think one of the one a big question that's always coming up in combination product development is when in the development process for a combination product should the device team get brought in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and we get these questions all the time. Uh, the simple answer to this is you should engage with the device partner as soon as you establish your route of administration and the target product profile, right? So as soon as you solidify these two, this should be around the late phase one, early phase two, and of course, well before the IND submission. So that's a good time frame to account for, especially when you have different stages you have to go through before you select a device.
Okay, what type of why is that important in your mind? Getting involved early, getting device input early.
I think companies don't account for um, the right amount of time for planning purposes. So we always recommend, from your IND submission date or the clinical trial with a combination date, taking into consideration 18 to 14 months prior to your IND, and this is to account for early development, which including the feasibility phase and preparation for your compliance with 21 CFR Part 4. Usually, we account for the feasibility phase, the clinical configuration phase, and the commercial phase. But even before the design control, operating under design controls, you have to complete a few steps prior to development under design controls.
Okay. So you're talking about design controls. Could you give what is a high level device development roadmap? What does that look like, from a design control and risk management? If you were to kind of, help people understand at a really high level, what does that roadmap look like?
Yeah, so like I said, we usually divide it into three different buckets. The first bucket is your feasibility phase, which that's the phase where you conduct your landscape, decide on one or two or three device platforms you want to evaluate, and as part of that, you go through maybe a usability evaluation. You go through primary container selection. You go through device testing, preliminary testing. Of course, you don't have your design input set up already, but initial testing based on the minimum requirement expected from FDA, as well as establishing your quality management system to be ready for operating under design control. So that's the SOP framework, as well as other elements, including clinical and regulatory elements that occurs or should occur during the feasibility phase. Once you have this established and you down select the device platform and you all set up from a quality management perspective, then you can actually engage with your CMO, your device partner, and start operating under design controls for your clinical development. So the clinical development is where you apply your design controls. You apply the SOPs you established, your processes that you established, and start developing your combination products. Of course, this is a reiterative process, and where you also start implementing risk management activities. The next bucket in your device roadmap should account for commercial as well as validation step. So in this bucket, you establish your design transfer, you prepare for your validation studies, you prepare for your design validation build, as well as finalizing everything you need in terms of commercial launch. So this is very high level, but that's when I'm referring to the device roadmap. These are the three main buckets that we see um, pharmaceutical companies take or should take into account.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, what are some of the biggest issues you see or have been seeing if some of these device aspects are brought in too late into the development?
Yeah, it's a good point. When the device development starts too late, you start introducing several risks, right? Um, from from clinical device perspective, the clinical device may not reflect the commercial configuration, and that will require costly and consuming bridging studies later on. Human factors is a huge part of combination product, so the human factors validation may be delayed. That will impact almost directly on your submission timeline. And then when you talk about drug device technical incompatibilities, that's introducing a device late in the game will impact that, and uh, topics like injection forces issues, breakage, or dose accuracy problems may surface and
Yeah.
create delays through the whole process. And then we also see I mentioned the compliance with Part 4. So from a quality management perspective, we see a lot of gaps if you introduce device late in the game, because then you have to update your whole quality management system to align with what expected for devices. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, these risks essentially will impact your clinical trial start date, impact your submission start date, and may even require redesign after a pivotal study.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I know you mentioned the quality system one a few times, and this is something, yeah, I've seen a lot of also where basically I think it comes down to like when a pharma company decides to go into combination products, a lot of times they're waiting for some critical clinical trial data, and then once they get good data, it's like off to the races.
Yeah.
All of a sudden they decide they want to be in the clinic in X amount of months, or they want to be in a clinical trial, right, like with the combination product. And again, it's off to the races trying to go through the development process. At the same time, the QMS is not even updated yet, right? So it creates all these kind of conflicting priorities, and that QMS is something that I think early on it's relatively efficient to get a relatively simple design control risk management process updated and integrated into the QMS. But then later downstream, as you're getting ready for launch or even clinical launch, right? The complaint side, pharmacovigilance side, I see then a lot of times companies are panicking, especially as you go to commercial, to try to get all of these different quality system procedures updated, right? Outside of development, of course, right? With change control, on market support, pharmacovigilance, and in some of these areas. And and just to add one more to what you mentioned a little bit about verification. This is another area where a lot of times companies they know they're going into a combination product. They underestimate a lot of the work that's needed, and when it comes, they're ready to go to design verification, but they don't realize how much effort it actually takes to get to design verification. right? So, for example, test method validation and all the work you have to do beforehand to make sure you have the right requirements with the right sample sizes and the right test methods, particular, causes a lot of issues and delays in projects. So I think it's important to go through that solid design control risk management process up front
Hmm.
to get a very solid design verification plan, do your test method validation, and go to your into your design verification phase knowing exactly what you need to test and having the test methods validated.
Yeah,
This
if you
Yeah.
talk about, sorry, if you talk about design verification and TMD, the development of the test methods, right, as well as the test method validation. If you operate with, if you down select a commercially approved device platform, that device manufacturer or the device partner may provide those test method to you, validated or not, but eh, often when you go into the test method validation, uh, companies tend to underestimate how much work it's needed, because no one says that the first test method validation will go smoothly. If you have any gaps or any failures, that will cause another 2, 3, 4 weeks of delay per each test method, right?
Yeah,
So
that's a good point.
yeah.
So yeah, on that topic in general, let's say device team does get involved early enough, right? And now the next big question, right, is choosing the right delivery system, right? So a lot of big trend right now is off the shelf with pre-filled syringe, auto injector, on body injector. So assuming you're selecting one off the shelf, right? What do companies need to consider when doing when selecting a platform?
Yeah, so when you consider a device for your combination product, um, or when a clinical trial involves a device, the timeline must account for both drug development and device development requirements. So this is where um, those both streams, development streams, do not move at the same time. Device activity may often be underestimated. So to your question, I always say, um, keep in mind four key considerations when you evaluate or when you consider a device, right? So there is a design controls and regulatory requirement element, that the first thing that you have to account for, meaning, device constituent part must be developed under design controls. That will require, we talked about it, the QMS update and the proper SOPs, and then which you know also entails compliance with 21 CFR Part 4 for combination products. Um, so these two needs to be taken into consideration. The next key consideration would be your human factors strategy, which means you have to account for a few formative studies across the development process, um, or before you hit your clinical trial even. And I've seen, even recently, companies tend to skip that part and just introduce a device for the first time in clinical trial. If you established a good data uh, from a different program, that may be good, but just jumping without any formative evaluation prior to a clinical trial is something that you know needs to come in mind and be taken into consideration. So under the human factor strategy, you also have to evaluate and see who your intended users are. If it's just a patient, are you expecting a healthcare provider administer the drug? Is there a caregiver in the taken into consideration? So all in all, human factors, strategy, and validation timing should be taken into consideration when you say, "Hey, I wanna have a device in my clinical trial as part of my combination product." The third key element is the technical compatibility. Most pharma, they do understand that there is a primary container or primary container closure that and compatibility that you have to show a compliance with, or compatibility with, not compliance. But there's also, from a formulation characteristic standpoint, um, you know, characteristics such as viscosity, the volume that you have to administer, the stability, These are all needs to be compatible with the with the selected drug delivery system that you're gonna um, take into trials, right? And then the fourth key element that you have to see is your CMO selection and manufacturing readiness, because clinical supply manufacturing needs to be set, the assembly needs to be set, the packaging processes, the packet label, everything needs to be established and in control, right? And control, not under in control. And then the lead times for device components can significantly impact your development process. Even for feasibility, we see companies expect device partners of components manufacturers to provide them for, once they place a PO. That's how it works. That's not how it works. Usually, you can have a delay time of 4 to 8 weeks just to receive components, right? So that's something that you have to account for. So selecting the right delivery system requires structured input from three main domains, right? So what we do usually when we have a formulation, when we have a pharmaceutical coming and asking for the right device, we say, hey, let's get some input, right? Input consideration
Yeah.
from the people who oversee formulation and technicals, right? People who understand the clinical consideration, even business and strategic considerations needs to be accounted for. So this is how we do it. We collect the input, and based on that, we provide the most suitable device platform for that product asset.
Yeah, those are a lot of good points, and it's a pretty. I know it's a lot of work, to go through that, and I know a lot of time companies are up against tight timelines and scrambling to try to find the right delivery system, and usually it's at about on average, I would say a phase two, going into phase two.
Yeah.
So again, with all the Russian, there are mistakes made. And what are some of the biggest mistake companies make at that stage when making the selection?
Yeah. So I would say if you need to account for the right of the drug development drug delivery system, I would highly emphasize the like I said, those four key elements. But I think not taking into account the time and efforts required to introduce a device. That's something that
You see that as a big mistake?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because people perceive, not people, but sometimes when you have stakeholders very knowledgeable from the drug, the formulation size, and they coming into the device world, this is where both worlds intersect, and even terminology is not quite there, but also at the time that's required to execute all these activities, it's it's not something that they expect to have. They think the device is some sort of accessory. So as long as you're good on the
Yeah.
primary container, yeah, we're just going to bundle it with a compatible drug delivery, right? And then we can move on. But the thing is, you know, if you go with a platform and stay within these boundaries of that the device platform was verified and validated, that's okay. But when you go out of those boundaries, if you evaluate a new user population, a new indication, um, if you go higher volume, right, of viscosity, very viscous drug product,
Yeah.
this is where your device platform is not going to be a slam dunk, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, and then the big challenge I see a lot of times is sometimes a little bit too much rushing, maybe because there's a partnership deal or there's some, pressure from management and assuming that the user population, the commercial user population will be able to utilize the product,
Yeah.
right? From a human factor standpoint. And of course, usually that phase two, even phase three, but definitely phase two is most of the time will be administered by a healthcare professional, right? The HCPs.
Yeah.
So I see them not kind of as worried about it, and then downstream running into some human factors issues later on.
Yeah. And other mistakes, could be related to failing to implement design controls, and that's where I was hinting, during your feasibility phase before starting your clinical development, implement design controls that will save you a lot of trouble down the line, or not allocating sufficient time and for a quick, even informative study. Um, but I think the biggest hurdle that I've seen in the market is operating in silos. You know, drug device regulatory and clinical teams are not aligned on the milestones, on the terminology, on the time that and resources required to execute the activities as a combination product as a whole.
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Do you have any thoughts on why those silos exist?
I think it is related to obviously the knowledge required, but also um, the training and executive coaching. Because even at the senior level, senior management level, sometimes the lack of training and understanding the resources and the time and the, I mean, the basics is the activities that you have to go through. This is something that this is where the disconnect is, right? So I think educating your team as soon as possible will contribute greatly to your development success and commercial launch success.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a lot of these pharma companies developing combo products, there's these very large silos that exist between the device organization and the pharma organization. And throughout my career, I've saw this like just about everywhere. And earlier in my career was at the big companies, and throughout a lot of our consulting and work with different clients. Now we get to see it kind of at the mid-size, large companies, and on also at the forefront when companies are just starting. It's really interesting, and it seems to be the normal progression that I see is pharma company wants to get into combo products, and even though they knew it may be coming, again waiting for the right clinical data, then all of a sudden now it's full speed to clinic, right? and and trying to build a device organization like as quickly as possible, right, without all of the right integration points. And then over time, as these organizations grow, they just become more siloed. And from there, there's more chaos and more unorganization, even to the extent where, from a cultural standpoint, the groups start to not like each other, right? At a personal level. I saw that also. So I think I like what you're talking about training, because I think it's really critical for device and pharma teams to really understand each other's language, right? And then also make sure they understand why each other are doing what they're doing, right? So, for example, like if someone on the pharma side has to review a design input document, or
Mhm.
has to participate in a design review, or has to now take time to review and sign that seventh version of the risk assessment,
Yeah.
they understand why, right? It's not just because maybe the device people are crazy and they're trying to create work. There's usually a reason why. And same for device people understanding on the pharma side why they choose the sample sizes they do, and why they do the stability testing the way they do. So from most of from my experience and my perspective, a lot of the challenges with pharma companies developing combination products stems from these actual cultural challenges between silos. And that's what causes a lot of the chaos. And simply making sure both groups are trained, right, at a certain level, as you mentioned, that alone actually goes a long way. And then from the beginning, even at a quality system level, making sure the processes are integrated appropriately. That's also a good way to start from the beginning, right? To minimize the risk of these silos. Those are some things I've observed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think it should be applied on both sides, right? Not just the clinical and the drug development team, also the device team. So if there's a lack of knowledge related to the clinical strategy, the clinical plan, um, are we going to have a bridging study, um, down the line? This is something that I find more and more where device people have less knowledge in the clinical clinical trial sequence and strategy, and training can be or should be applied on device team as well when it comes to the drug side.
Yeah, and even from an organizational standpoint, right? All the different team members, right, and what their roles are quite different in the different organizations.
Yeah, yeah. So when I just want to take you for talking a little bit about the from an organization standpoint. Um, what do you see? Where does a company or pharmaceutical company should start with when they're thinking about their um, the device team or the person who is going to lead the device development? Is this
Yeah.
something? And I'm mainly referring to those mid-sized pharma companies that needs to establish a development process and execute activities. Do you think it's a smart thing to kind of go all in and hire the full device development team? Where should they even start?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Usually, what we see is it usually starts if a pharma company is getting into combination product. Usually, it starts with someone on the CMC side or drug formulation or drug product side is responsible for developing the drug, right? And now all of a sudden, if it's like an injectable with a PFS or auto injector on body injector, now there's this device component, and it usually rolls up to them and being responsible for the overall development. And it's challenging because for a full device development, there's similar to on the pharma side, there's a lot of discrete expertise that's needed, right? We need to have our device development, right? Human factors, quality, regulatory, design transfer. These are kind of like the core buckets, right? And I would say on the regulatory side, you need to have the not just the lead, who's usually more experienced with pharma, like
Mhm.
leading NDAs and BLAs and Type C meetings and whatnot and INDs, but then a device regulatory expert that also has that combo product experience that knows um, what to write into the device section of the IND or the Type C meeting request or the NDA, BLA, etc. Then, of course, on the quality side, device combo quality experience to update the quality system and also to review and approve deliverables from a device quality standpoint. But on the R&D side, this is where there's still a various expertise needed, right? For example, there is requirements writing, there's systems engineering, there's risk management. A lot of those could be combined
Yeah.
at a lot of times with the same person. But then there's also the verification, planning, and the design engineering responsible for the design output specifications, and then from there, you could also get into validation and human factors. But usually the human factors and validation people are it's a different talent profile. So you could integrate a lot of that device development or expertise, but you definitely want to have individuals that understand requirements, risks, understand how to bring things together from a systems perspective. Then, of course, your human factors, as I mentioned, in design transfer. So the full development team, right, the full device organization could get pretty complex, and usually a lot of the larger top 20 pharma companies have big device organizations, right? And then companies getting into pharma will usually start a little with lighter on the full-time hires, and then they'll use fractional consultants or full-time consultants to piece in the organization. And then as that clinical pipeline builds up and you start getting more activity, usually we'll start building out the device organization. And we also do a lot of work on that at an executive level, helping to design device organizations. And usually that first hire will be a director of device development, and then start adding more people to that layer as you, again, build that clinical pipeline and get closer to commercial.
Yeah, yeah. When I think about this, um, is there is there an with companies being fully remote these days? Um, do you think is there an absolutely what absolutely cannot be outsourced if you need to pick a function or functions? What would you say you would skip with outsourcing it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think at a minimum from a QMS standpoint, right? Like it's really important that the manufacturer has control over the overall process, right? So they need to have some, at a minimum, some expertise in-house, right? And make sure that it's controlled properly through the QMS and those quality agreements. And then from there, it varies based on each company, right? And then it also varies a lot on if you're, I think the overall strategy, right, from a combination product standpoint,
Yeah.
like is the strategy to do off the shelf, right, products and work with companies and device platform companies that have a lot of capabilities internally already, such as design verification testing, potentially contract manufacturing and design, or if you go with a bespoke device, right, and
Mhm.
trying to do something more innovative.
Yeah.
So that could have a big influence on how much expertise they need in-house versus external. So, on that topic, that's actually something I meant to ask you about earlier when we were talking about device selection. I mean, that's clearly it seems like the trend is off the shelf, but what about bespoke devices or doing something new and innovative? How could should pharma companies decide platform versus bespoke? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah. Again, we've seen this this topic comes up with every new drug product that the company is trying to evaluate and you know find the right device for their drug product. But I think ultimately the decision depends on the drug itself, the
Yeah.
intended user population, and
Hmm.
what's the company's commercial and regulatory risk appetite, right? So I think the starting point should be structured around input from those three main areas. So the drug formulation constraints, right? You have to understand, you know, is my drug how viscous is my drug? What's the dose size in terms of volume, right? Are we going 20 ml? Are we going 1 ml? Um, and then you have to look at your user and clinical requirements. Who are your users? What is the clinical settings? And then also from a business strategy and market access positioning, where you want to be is the drug is the blockbuster and this is what makes it unique, or you have to um, you know get a unique device in order to become a outstanding combination product in the market. So I think a platform approach generally reduces technical uncertainty because it already established the design, it established the manufacturing process. It has a verification data established already. If it's a commercially approved device platform, then you already know because on the FDA database you can find those known use errors. And also from a validation standpoint, from usability standpoint, it has been already validated, and you have some data you can rely on. So we see often companies go with the device platform just to de-risk the program.
Yeah.
But I must say, the device platform not always is going to be a slam dunk. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, if you go outside those boundaries of the verification, validation, the intended user groups, um, then you introduce a new risk to your device platform. Um,
Yeah, no, those are all really good points.
yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the trend that I'm seeing is, usually a pharma company, when they're getting into combo products for the first time, usually it's they want to minimize risk, so they tend to go with something off the shelf commercial. There's other strategies, especially like with generics, where or could potentially be applied to biosimilars, where it's so I've seen companies where sometimes they want to have IP around the delivery system,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the theory there is if you could reduce medication errors or develop a safer product or make the delivery more user friendly, right? And you have the IP on the delivery system, then people are going to buy your generic more, right? So that's in theory a reason for going down this a bespoke path. But the tricky thing is it's very, very hard to justify the extra cost of any of those features, right? That's from my experience. I've witnessed that 9 times out of 10, it's very tricky to justify the extra cost in the research and development. And then, especially when you go to manufacturing, the capital equipment cost and then the piece part cost, like with those scales, not having those scales of economy in place. So, if a company wants to go that direction, it's really important to do a lot of that market research and cost analysis up front. I would highly recommend that before you go down that path.
Yeah. And
Otherwise, you end up pouring a lot of money into it, and the usually it's hard to get a good net present value on the program. And I've seen a lot of projects killed because of that on the bespoke path.
yeah, on the bespoke solution, I would say it would be appropriate when, the drug has unique technical requirements, like I mentioned, viscosity or
Yeah.
drug, that cannot be accommodated by a commercially approved common device platform. You can also consider a bespoke device if the intended use scenario demands, I don't know, um, differentiated user experience. Um, Also, you should explore bespoke solution when the device itself is part of the competitive advantage. That's why I mentioned earlier the landscape assessment, in terms of what's out there, what's being developed, and what may be introduced, for the same indication, with a specific device. But I would say that the more on the risk curve for a bespoke solution, the more novel you get, the more novel your solution is, the more exposed you are to technical and regulatory risks, right? And the more complex your device is, or the device platform is, the higher the cost and the timeline to market is going to be.
Okay, well, that was a great discussion. Thanks again for joining us today. And David, really appreciate the conversation and insights. And for everyone watching, if you found this discussion valuable, please consider sharing it with a colleague or your professional network. You can also follow Ventura Solutions here and on LinkedIn for more insights, or feel free to connect with me directly on LinkedIn. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next Spotlight interview.